This time on PedalBox, we're reassembling our front suspension and trying to get the car back on the floor. A few episodes ago you saw us rebuild all of our rear suspension. We've got new bearings in the rear hubs and that's all back together looking really, really nice. So we're going to try and do the same on the front. There's a few parts here that we've got to replace. We've got to get new tie rods on because the rubbers are perished around there. Mechanically it's great, there's no slop or anything in there, but because the boot's gone, that would be a test fail. We've got the same problem on the lower ball joints, which are also perfectly healthy mechanically, but again, same, because it's perished, they'd be like dust ingress and everything, so they wouldn't last very long on the road. The other thing that we may have to deal with, and we're not sure about this yet, that'll be like pending a road test, is building a new upper arm to take all that caster out, because we do have quite a bit of lean back between our two joints here, which may screw us when we go out to drive it. But we're going to kick that can down the road, get this all back together and see how it behaves. So right now we've already got new bearings in the front and you can see we've reassembled most of the suspension. It all seems to work pretty well at the minute. The part that did kind of surprise me is the new bearings are already kind of tight. We don't have, or it seems at least, like we don't have to put a little stub axle in here to like preload the whole thing together. We're probably going to do that anyway just to be safe. It's probably reasonable to assume that because this is always at least a front-wheel drive car, they were obviously rear-wheel drive variants as well, sorry, four-wheel drive variants as well, but all of them did have a drive shaft in here, and I would guess that that probably provides some mechanical support to the inner bearing race. So we're going to put a stub axle in anyway, even though it doesn't really feel like we desperately need one. There's no slop or no wobble or anything in these, they're nice and tight. So for now we've kept all the brakes off. That gives us easier access to sort out that stub axle in the back, and it also just kind of improves our ability to sort of look around and see where everything's at. But we're going to put the rotor back on so that we can actually get the wheel back on. Then that way when we're on the ground everything's like actually held in the right place. We'll be able to do our alignment, because there's a good chance that this is wildly out of whack. Obviously, being as this is a completely custom suspension, we don't have factory guidelines on toe and camber and caster and everything, so we're going to have to try and make a guess at what would be a reasonable setup. Our current plan, as far as I know, is to find out what is on the front end of a Caterham, or at least, you know, some variants of Caterhams, and try and figure out like a reasonable set of defaults. It's probably going to be like a degree or two of toe in or toe out or something, a couple of degrees of camber, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to try and find a reasonable baseline from another car that's approximately like ours and replicate it as best we can on here.
So to make our little compression axles, which are just going to sit in and not really go to anything inside the car, we're going to need some compatible axles, and this is a pair of R32 style hubs. Now the regular ones that we've got on the back, these have a big thread on the end, a big hub nut goes on there, and you just crank this down until it stops, or you get to the right torque setting, either or. So that's how they fit on. The R32 style ones have a different fitting inside the hub. They're a completely different hub unit because they have that lower drop spindle on, and they actually fasten with something more akin to this, albeit this is actually an M14 bolt and the ends of these are M16 by 1.5, and yes, you guessed it, I have misplaced the two bolts out the end of the axle. So there's two of those on order, but this goes into the end, this bolts in, and it pulls the whole thing together in much the same way as this hub does, pulling the splines on. The splines are exactly the same. It is just a slightly different mounting. I have no idea why it is. If you know why it is, put it in the comments and then we can all learn and enjoy the edification together. So obviously we don't need all of this axle just flopping around inside next to our radiator. We literally just want the end so we can get some preload on those bearings. And they are looking all right. They're feeling a lot better than the ones in the rear that we did. But basically, we need to take this whole section apart and just take this cup off. So let's get to cutting apart these axles and hopefully not splattering the entire garage with CV grease. So here you can see how a CV joint works. You have the axle coming through the center and that goes into the internal part of this cage. And on the outside of the cage, there are ball bearings. Now these ball bearings are trapped between this cage into here and they go into the outside of the cup. That way this can move around, but if this is turning round as well, the whole thing is turning, the cage is turning, the outside is turning, which is what actually engages into the hub. So this runs through and the whole thing works. Now, I've never had to take apart one that is actually functional and hasn't had the cage completely shatter into parts. So this is going to be a little bit interesting because I'm honestly not sure how I'm going to break this in some sensible way. That was a lot easier than I expected. So you can see this is where the splines go into, and this is that inner part of the cage which has 6 massive ball bearings that live inside. And then as this pivots around, the whole thing can switch up. And you see how this central part pivots so much further than the outer part. So you get a massive amount of movement and translation whilst maintaining your drive from the centre, through this ring, through this ring, through the balls, into the outer cup. Really clever, and also horrible. These are messy and nasty, and so far I've managed not to get everything covered in CV grease, so I'm very, very happy. After a lot of cutting, what we have here is the bearing retainer splines, or at least what I'm calling the bearing retainer splines, because that's all that's left. These are no longer anything like an axle. They just have the thread left on the back, so we can put that bolt through I mentioned before. And unfortunately, I cannot find either of those 2 bolts. We actually got this set up a long time ago, before PedalBox was even a thing, when we upgraded the suspension on the front of the TT, and we received some R32 hubs, which is why we have them in stock. So that was very convenient, but has now come back to bite us about 8-9 years later. And we had to cut through a huge amount of the CV joint. You can see how far we actually had to get through. It's nearly 20 mil across in order to get that out, which was less than fun and did result in one of the grinding discs exploding as it got pinched in between the expanding metal. Now, because I can't find those 2 bolts, unfortunately that does pretty much nerf the idea of putting this on the ground, because we don't want to ruin them. As much as I think we probably could, and it will be fine because we're not driving anywhere, I don't want to replace another set of bearings just in case, and I can't categorically find any answer on the internet that says they should be fine if we just do that. So in some classic PedalBox fashion, we're going to do a bit of yak shaving. And that's why, for an episode where we started at the front of the car building the suspension, we have a benchtop power supply powering our number plate lights at the back of the car. So what is the yak that we need to shave? Well, to put the car on the ground, we need to put the wheels on. To put the wheels on, we need to put all the panels back on that we took off to remove the suspension before. No real big problem there. The problem comes inside the arch because we have all of this wiring loom that is not wrapped and also not 100% complete, and that's because of one small kludge that we did when we installed these number plate lights. At the moment, the number plate lights run off our tail lights. If we have the tail lights on, the number plate lights illuminate, and that's exactly what we want. Except if we have the parking lights on, the number plate lights aren't meant to illuminate. And at the moment, they only come on if one of them comes on, not the other one. And we're not sure if having extra lights turning on at that point will be an IVA failure, or if only having them come on in one instance and not both will be an IVA failure. Now, the obvious fix is just to wire these in properly, as they would have been from the factory, which goes to a fuse in the fuse box. On the TT, these are mounted in the tailgate, so this comes down and it illuminates down to the bottom, and that would be absolutely fine if we hadn't chopped the entire tailgate loom out, because we didn't have a tailgate, we don't have a heated rear window, so we just removed the whole thing, and we stripped it out really efficiently at the fuse box. So there is no wire that runs from there all the way to the back in any part of the wiring loom that runs all of the lights for the back of the car. This is, as you might expect, a massive oversight on our part, and we could have fixed this way back before we even thought about installing the lights, and we were just dealing with the wiring loom. But we didn't. And that means we need to run a new wire from the fuse in the fuse box all the way back to these lights so they turn on at the correct time. That means we need to add it into the wiring loom, then wire all of this back up properly, make sure it works, test it, then tape it up, then secure it inside the arch so it doesn't just flop around. Then we can put all of the panels back on in the back of the car. Then we can put the wheel on, and that is why we are shaving a particularly boring but massively important and inconvenient yak. Well, that's all of our cabling done. We can put this all back together, put the inner panels back into our wheel well, and put the wheels on, ready for next time. Might have to make a couple of small adjustments to that panel as well, but we'll do that off camera and not bore you too much. And with that, that's all of the wiring for all of the lights done. Fortunately, they seem to be working quite happily. We can put the rest of the panels in both wheel wells, put the wheels on, make sure these panels underneath are quite nice and snug, and we can finish off one other thing that I have been desperate to do this entire weekend.
So here is version 4 or 5 or God knows how many of the brake pedal switch holder. So it's in 2 pieces. We've got a top half there that clamps on and just holds the switch in place, and the switch itself drops in and keys into a couple of little cutouts in the bottom section. It's getting quite large now because we've worked out a new way of mounting it that hopefully makes it a lot easier to rig to the brake pedal. So I'm going to install this roughly in place here, and you might be able to see from where you are that my arm is almost at full extension, reaching to the end of the firewall where that actually slots in. And you can probably imagine now, seeing me cooped up in here, that I'm kind of thrilled about the fact that we're nearly done with this. I'm really looking forward to these being finished so that I can stop inserting myself into this little hole in the floor. It's getting quite uncomfortable. So we're nearly done with this. This is one of the 2 switches. We're currently using the wrong top half. We've attempted a few times to print a new one, and for some reason the prints keep failing. One of them, to the printer's credit, was because we forgot to turn on supports. So that's kind of on us. So there's a new one of those coming out shortly. But yeah, this seems to be roughly right. This is only half of it. We still have to make the lever arm that goes onto the brake pedal that actually presses onto the plunger. But this is the more difficult part, not least because it's so far away down in the bottom. At least the brake pedal half is relatively close, relatively easy to get to. So I can pop that down in there and pretend that doesn't exist for a minute. I've got Adrian standing off camera with the, sorry, this is all the reach I've got, mate, with the new clutch pedal switch holder. So the clutch switch is very firmly in there. I can't actually take it out to show you. It drops in from the top, and this little gap that you see between the 2 here, that fits over a piece of metal that fits over the side of the pedal box. So I can just drop this onto the side of the pedal box, and the little plunger there fits onto a little metal kind of arm tongue thing that's coming out the side of the pedal. So the pedal presses this one directly. We'd love to do a similar trick with the brake switch, but it's just too big. It's got too much throw, it's too far out and everything for us to do the same, which is why we've had to go for a slightly more elaborate setup. So I am going to grab the bolt for this, or rather, I'm going to ask Aid to get me the bolt for this and test fit this real quick and see if it's in the right spot. So you've got the 2 switches installed here now, and they both seem, as far as I can tell from here, to work fairly well. So they run the clutch pedal down here. It's a bit tricky to do all this one-handed, but you can see the plunger on the switch runs in nicely. The plunger doesn't skip off of the little pad we've made, so that's all looking pretty good. And then on the brake pedal switch up here, now obviously I can't really show you that working yet, but I can show you the rough plan for the brackets. We're going to run a little arm via these 2 holes in the brake pedal, run out, and you can see from there it's going to be roughly at the midpoint of the 2, and the amount of travel that we have at this point on the pedal arm roughly matches. There's quite a lot of travel on that plunger. It runs in quite a long way, and we've got just about the right amount there to match the amount of travel on the pedal. So when we build that structure out, that should work pretty well. And now for comedy effect, here's the video of me getting back out of here.
And with that, the wheels are back on the rear of the car. We don't have the front ones on, obviously. We're waiting on those bolts, so we can't put it on the ground. But when we do, we will actually be able to test our alignment, because there is no more play in this bearing, which is so good. It's so satisfying after so long. So thank you very much for watching this episode. It has derailed just a little bit along the way. We did get some important things done, and we've put some other ones into the next episode, but that is occasionally the way this goes, particularly on PedalBox. If you'd like to see the next stuff, you should definitely subscribe to the channel, like the video, and in the comments let us know what you would have done different besides something completely different to this. You can support us at patreon.com/PedalBox show from as little as $1 a month, and we are absolutely forever indebted to our patrons for helping us buy all of the bits that we need for this, the bits that we have that we lose that we need to buy again, and the bits that we didn't know that we didn't need. And if you are a patron, you will also get discount at shop.pedalbox.show, which you can buy merch like hats, t-shirts, and mugs, but without the used teaspoon in. We will see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. See you then.